It was supposed to be a normal Thursday evening, the kind where nothing exciting ever happens. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through social media while half paying attention to some reality TV show playing in the background. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional buzz of notifications from my phone. Life felt predictable, almost boring. But then, everything changed. My phone started vibrating violently on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with a name that made my stomach drop. Mom. Whenever she calls unexpectedly, it's usually because something has gone wrong. Still, I tried to sound calm as I answered. "Hey, Mom," I said casually, hoping she wouldn't hear the unease creeping into my voice. "Emily," she said, her tone rushed and breathless. "They took Jake." "Took Jake." My heart skipped a beat. "Took him where?" Before I could ask, she blurted out the rest. "The HOA security guys. They arrested him for trespassing or something. He's at the station right now." Arrested. My mind froze for a second. Arrested by HOA security asterisk. That didn't make any sense. Jake isn't perfect. He can be stubborn, sarcastic, and sometimes pushes boundaries. But he's no criminal. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding, right? Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. Grabbing my keys, I told Mom I'd be there as soon as possible and headed out the door. The drive to the police station felt longer than usual, every red light stretching into eternity. My thoughts raced ahead of me. What exactly happened? Why would private security working for the Homeowners Association arrest someone? And why Jake? When I finally arrived, Mom was already there, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her purse straps. She looked up when she saw me, relief washing over her features, but only for a moment. "They wouldn't tell me anything," she whispered hoarsely, her voice breaking. "Just that he was detained by private security officers working for the HOA. Private security for an HOA. It sounded ridiculous, but apparently this wasn't uncommon in our neighborhood, Willow Pines, a gated community known for its strict rules and overzealous enforcers. These so-called HOA cops weren't real police officers. They were just hired guards patrolling the streets to enforce things like parking regulations or lawn maintenance standards. But arresting people, that seemed extreme. Dad joined us shortly after, looking equally frazzled. Together, we demanded answers. After what felt like hours of waiting, they finally allowed us to see Jake. When he walked into the small meeting room, his usual confident smirk was replaced by a grim expression. Something serious had happened, and I needed to know what it was. As I sat down across from him, all I could think about was how surreal the situation felt. 1 minute, life was ordinary, and the next, my brother was sitting in a police station, accused of something he clearly didn't do. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about uncovering the truth behind these fake HOA cops and why they thought they had the authority to ruin someone's life over nothing. By the time we were finally allowed to sit down with Jake, my nerves were stretched thin. The fluorescent lights in the small, windowless room buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow on everything. Jake slumped into the chair across from us, his usual swagger replaced by a look of frustration and exhaustion. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply before he began to explain what had happened. "It's insane, Em," he started, leaning forward. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just helping out the neighbors like they asked me to." Apparently, earlier that day, Jake had gone over to check on Mr. and Mrs. Thompson's house while they were out of town. They were friends of ours, kind, elderly people who always brought cookies during the holidays. Before leaving, they'd given Jake a spare key and asked him to water their plants and collect the mail every few days. It was a simple favor, something anyone would do for a neighbor. But according to Jake, things took a sharp turn when 2 men in khaki uniforms showed up at the Thompsons' front door. They banged on the door loud enough to wake the dead, Jake said, shaking his head. When I opened it, they demanded to know what I was doing inside. I told them straight up, I'm here because the Thompsons asked me to be. But instead of backing off, they got even more aggressive. One of the men kept pressing him, asking for ID and saying he matched the description of someone involved in recent vandalism cases around the neighborhood. Jake tried to reason with them, explaining who he was and why he was there, but they didn't listen. Instead, one of them called for backup, or rather, their version of backup. Within minutes, another van pulled up, and Jake found himself being handcuffed and shoved into the back of it. They wouldn't let me call you guys or even explain myself, Jake continued, his voice rising with frustration. I kept telling them this was all a big mistake, but they acted like I was some hardened criminal. Listening to him recount the story made my blood boil. How could these so-called security guards treat someone like this without any evidence? Sure, Willow Pines was known for its strict rules, but this went way beyond enforcing guidelines about mailbox colors or lawn height. This was about power. Unchecked, unearned power. And it terrified me. As Jake spoke, Dad scribbled notes furiously on a scrap of paper he pulled from his pocket. Mom sat silently beside me, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white. She looked like she wanted to cry but was holding it together, for now. And then, Jake added, lowering his voice, as if someone might overhear, they said I fit the description of the guy behind those vandalism incidents last week. Can you believe that? Vandalism. My jaw dropped. The thought of Jake spray painting houses or smashing windows was laughable. He wasn't exactly a rule follower, but he wasn't destructive either. Still, the accusation lingered uncomfortably in the air. If they could mistake Jake for a vandal, how many other innocent people had been targeted? Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. I don't get it, Em. Why would they jump to conclusions like that? And why does an HOA need its own private army anyway? That was the question burning in all of our minds. Something about this whole situation felt off. Not just the arrest itself, but the way these security officers operated. They weren't real cops. They didn't have badges or legal authority. Yet here we were, sitting in a police station, trying to figure out how to clear Jake's name. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. These fake HOA cops weren't just overstepping their boundaries. They were trampling on people's rights. What gave them the power to detain someone based on nothing more than suspicion? And what else were they capable of if left unchecked? Before I could say anything, Mom interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. We'll fix this, Jake. We'll make sure everyone knows the truth. Her words were meant to reassure him, but they only highlighted how fragile trust had become in our once peaceful neighborhood. As we sat there, piecing together the events of the day, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about exposing the dark underbelly of Willow Pines and finding out just how far the HOA was willing to go to maintain control. After Jake finished explaining what had happened, the room fell silent for a moment. The weight of his story hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. My mind raced with questions. How could this happen? Why would anyone think Jake was capable of vandalism or breaking into a house? And most importantly, who were these so-called security guards who felt entitled to act like police officers? Mom broke the silence first, her voice trembling slightly as she asked, did they even check with the Thompsons? Surely they must have known you were supposed to be there. Jake shook his head, frustration evident in his tone. I told them to call the Thompsons, but they ignored me. They acted like they already knew everything and didn't need any proof, like I was guilty until proven innocent. Dad frowned, tapping his pen against the notepad where he'd been jotting things down. This doesn't add up, he said slowly. Even if they thought you were suspicious, they can't just arrest someone without evidence. There are laws for this kind of thing. But that was the problem. They weren't real police officers. These men worked for the HOA, which meant they operated under a different set of rules, or maybe no rules at all. From what we'd heard, the HOA's private security team had been given free rein to enforce guidelines, issue fines, and patrol the neighborhood. But detaining people, handcuffing them, and throwing them into vans, that seemed far beyond their jurisdiction. As Jake continued talking, another detail caught my attention. They kept mentioning vandalism, he said, his brow furrowing. Apparently, someone's been spray painting fences and smashing mailboxes around here lately. But when I asked why they thought it was me, they said I fit the description. What does that even mean? It sounded vague and dangerous. If these fake cops could accuse anyone based on such flimsy reasoning, then no one in Willow Pines was safe. A chill ran down my spine as I realized how easily this could happen to someone else. Maybe it already had. Mom leaned forward, her expression softening as she looked at Jake. "We'll figure this out, sweetheart. We'll talk to the police chief, get your side of the story on record, and make sure everyone knows the truth." But even as she spoke, I noticed the tension in her voice. She was trying to stay strong for Jake, but I could tell she was scared. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about standing up to a system that seemed designed to intimidate people into submission. Just then, Dad stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth across the small room. "Enough is enough," he muttered under his breath. "If the HOA thinks they can throw people in jail without due process, they've gone too far. We're not letting them get away with this." His words sparked something inside me, a mix of anger and determination. For years, we'd accepted the HOA's strict rules because we assumed they were meant to keep the neighborhood safe and beautiful. But now it felt like those rules were being used as weapons, wielded by people who cared more about control than community. Before we could come up with a plan, a tall man in a dark suit entered the room. His presence commanded immediate attention, and even the desk sergeant outside straightened up as he approached. He introduced himself as Agent Michael Reynolds from the FBI, explaining that Jake had been working undercover as part of an investigation into corruption within the HOA leadership. The revelation hit us like a ton of bricks. Jake glanced at me sheepishly, clearly aware of how blindsided I felt. None of us, not Mom, not Dad, not me, had any idea he'd been involved in something so big. As Agent Reynolds began filling us in, the pieces started falling into place. The aggressive patrols, the constant surveillance, the ridiculous fines. It wasn't about maintaining property values. It was about power, greed, and intimidation. Suddenly, everything made sense. The vandalism accusations weren't random. They were part of a larger scheme to silence dissent and maintain control. And Jake, whether he realized it or not, had stumbled right into the middle of it. As the agent spoke, I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for my brother. Sure, he'd kept secrets from us, but he'd also risked himself to expose the truth. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging fear that this wasn't over yet. If the HOA was willing to go this far, what would they do next? The moment Agent Reynolds introduced himself, the room seemed to shrink. His calm demeanor and sharp gaze commanded respect, but there was also something unsettling about his sudden appearance. Here we were, reeling from Jake's arrest and the absurdity of the HOA's actions, and now an FBI agent was walking us through a conspiracy that sounded like it belonged in a movie, not our neighborhood. Agent Reynolds wasted no time getting to the point. "Your brother has been assisting us with an ongoing investigation into corruption within the Willow Pines HOA," he explained, his voice steady and professional. "What happened today wasn't random. It's part of a pattern of behavior we've been monitoring for months." Months. My head spun as I glanced at Jake, who gave me an apologetic shrug. He'd known about this the entire time and hadn't said a word. I wanted to be angry, but the gravity of the situation overshadowed everything else. This wasn't just about my brother anymore. It was about exposing something much bigger. Reynolds went on to explain that the vandalism incidents Jake had been accused of were likely fabricated, or worse, staged, to create chaos and fear among residents. The goal? To justify the HOA's increasingly aggressive tactics, including hiring private security officers who acted more like enforcers than protectors. These fake cops weren't just patrolling the streets. They were intimidating people into compliance, silencing anyone who dared question their authority. They use fear to maintain control, Reynolds said bluntly. If you challenge them, they retaliate. Arrests, fines, threats, it's all designed to keep people in line. As he spoke, memories came flooding back. The neighbor who got fined for painting her front door a shade of blue not approved by the HOA. The man whose car was towed because it sat too long in his own driveway. Even small things, like holiday decorations being removed overnight without explanation. None of it seemed coincidental anymore. It was systematic. A campaign to strip away individual freedoms under the guise of maintaining order. Mom looked pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. But why would they go this far? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's just a neighborhood. That's what makes it so dangerous, Reynolds replied. People expect organizations like HOAs to be harmless, just groups of neighbors working together to keep things nice. But when power goes unchecked, it can spiral out of control quickly. In this case, certain members of the HOA board have been using their positions to embezzle funds, manipulate property values, and silence opposition. Embezzlement? Manipulation. The words felt surreal, like they didn't belong in the same sentence as homeowners association. Yet, as Reynolds laid out the evidence, it became impossible to deny. Fake arrests like Jake's weren't isolated incidents. They were tools used to intimidate residents and prevent them from speaking out. Dad leaned forward, his jaw tight. So, what happens now? Are you going to shut them down? Reynolds nodded. We're building a case against key members of the HOA leadership, including the head of security. Their actions today, detaining your son without probable cause, are just one piece of the puzzle. With Jake's cooperation, we've gathered enough information to take action. The relief in the room was palpable, but it was short-lived. As grateful as we were for Reynolds' intervention, I couldn't shake the unease lingering in the back of my mind. How many other families had been targeted like ours? How many innocent people had been bullied or silenced before they could fight back? Jake finally broke the silence, his tone serious for once. I didn't know it would go this far, he admitted. I thought I was just gathering info, maybe helping catch a few bad apples. I didn't realize how deep it ran. His words hung in the air, heavy and sobering. For the first time, I truly understood the risks he'd taken, and the courage it must have taken to play along while keeping this secret from everyone he loved. As Agent Reynolds wrapped up his briefing, promising to ensure Jake's name was cleared and the HOA held accountable, I found myself reflecting on the fragility of trust. In a place like Willow Pines, where manicured lawns and white picket fences symbolized safety and stability, it was easy to overlook the cracks beneath the surface. But now those cracks had widened into chasms, exposing the truth. Rules are meant to protect, not oppress. And sometimes, standing up to authority isn't just brave, it's necessary. The next few hours felt like a whirlwind. After Agent Reynolds left to coordinate with local law enforcement, we were ushered into a larger meeting room at the station. This time, the police chief himself was present, a tall man with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression that made it clear he wasn't happy about the situation either. Sitting across from him, I couldn't help but notice how stiffly he held himself, as if bracing for an argument he knew was coming. Agent Reynolds wasted no time laying out the facts. He explained in detail how the HOA's private security team had operated outside legal boundaries, detaining residents without probable cause and fabricating charges to protect their own interests. The vandalism accusations against Jake, completely baseless. The arrests, intimidation tactics meant to silence dissent, and the HOA board members pulling the strings, corrupt individuals using their power to line their pockets while keeping the neighborhood under their thumb. This isn't just negligence, Reynolds said firmly. his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "It's abuse of authority. If you don't take immediate action, we will." The chief listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little. When Reynolds finished, the chief exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples as though trying to process everything. Finally, he spoke. "I've suspected something was off for a while now," he admitted, his tone weary. "But until today, I didn't have enough evidence to act. These people, they know how to cover their tracks." Hearing him confirm our suspicions sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just paranoia. This really was happening. The HOA leadership had been playing a dangerous game, hiding behind rules and regulations to mask their corruption. And now, thanks to Jake's involvement with the FBI, the truth was finally coming to light. Within hours, warrants were issued for the arrests of key figures within the HOA, including the head of security whose name kept popping up in connection with multiple shady dealings. News spread quickly throughout Willow Pines, and by morning, whispers filled the air. Some neighbors expressed outrage, grateful someone had finally exposed the truth. Others defended the HOA, claiming the investigation was overblown or politically motivated. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over again. For Jake, life began to return to some semblance of normalcy, but not entirely. Neighbors who once avoided him now approached him with gratitude, thanking him for standing up to the HOA and shining a light on its dark secrets. Even Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, back from their trip, insisted on hosting a small gathering to celebrate his bravery. It was surreal to see him go from being labeled a criminal to becoming a reluctant hero overnight. Still, Jake handled the attention with his usual mix of sarcasm and charm. "Guess I'm officially the guy who took down the evil homeowners association," he joked one evening during dinner. But despite his lighthearted tone, I could see the weight of everything he'd been through lingering in his eyes. Playing undercover hadn't been easy, and knowing what he did now about the lengths people would go to maintain control must have shaken him more than he let on. As for me, I found myself reflecting on the ripple effects of the scandal. Longtime residents grumbled about property values dropping due to negative press, while others argued the changes were necessary to prevent further abuse. Conversations around town turned heated, with opinions divided almost evenly. Despite the backlash, there was also a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. One thing became clear: the old Willow Pines was gone forever. Whether it would emerge stronger or fractured remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, people were talking openly about the issues plaguing the community instead of sweeping them under the rug. And sometimes, that's the first step toward real change. In the weeks that followed, Willow Pines felt like a neighborhood caught between two worlds. On one hand, there was a palpable sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. For years, residents had tiptoed around the HOA's strict rules, afraid to step out of line or speak up for fear of retaliation. But now, with key members of the board under investigation and the fake security team disbanded, people began to breathe easier. Conversations that once happened in hushed tones behind closed doors were suddenly taking place openly at coffee shops, parks, and even grocery store aisles. But not everyone was happy about the changes. Some longtime residents grumbled about how the scandal would affect property values. Who wants to move into a neighborhood where the HOA is synonymous with corruption? One neighbor muttered during a community meeting. Others defended the old leadership, claiming they'd only been trying to maintain standards, even if their methods were questionable. These defenders often shot icy glares at Jake whenever he walked by, as though blaming him personally for ruining the illusion of perfection. Tensions simmered just below the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. At a heated town hall meeting, tempers flared when new interim HOA leaders proposed scaling back some of the more extreme rules, like the ban on colorful front doors or the requirement to submit landscaping plans for approval months in advance. A few vocal opponents argued that relaxing these guidelines would lead to chaos, while supporters cheered, saying it was time to prioritize freedom over conformity. Amidst all this, Jake tried to stay low-key, but it wasn't easy. People either wanted to shake his hand and thank him for exposing the truth or avoid him altogether, treating him like he carried some kind of curse. He joked about it sometimes, calling himself public enemy number one. But I could tell it bothered him more than he let on. Even though he'd done nothing wrong and had actually helped uncover something important, he couldn't escape the feeling that he'd stirred up trouble nobody asked for. Agent Reynolds stayed in touch, checking in regularly to ensure Jake's safety and gather additional information as needed. To my surprise, Jake seemed to enjoy working with him, hinting that he might consider pursuing a career in law enforcement someday. "It's kind of cool knowing you can make a difference," he admitted one evening, flipping through a pamphlet about criminal justice programs. Still, life wasn't entirely smooth sailing. Every now and then, Jake would glance over his shoulder when walking home late at night or pause mid-conversation if someone unfamiliar approached him. "You never know who might still be loyal to those guys," he said darkly one day after spotting a former HOA board member glaring at him from across the street. It was a sobering reminder that not everyone involved in the scandal had faced consequences yet, and some may never face them at all. Dad took it upon himself to keep tabs on the ongoing investigations, poring over news articles and updates from local authorities. He became obsessed with making sure justice was served, attending every court hearing and filing formal complaints against anyone implicated in the corruption scheme. Mom, meanwhile, focused her energy on rebuilding trust within the community, hosting small gatherings to encourage neighbors to reconnect and share their thoughts without judgment. As for me, I found myself reflecting on how fragile trust really is. In places like Willow Pines, where manicured lawns and matching mailboxes symbolize harmony, it's easy to overlook the cracks beneath the surface. But once those cracks widen, they're hard to repair. The HOA scandal had exposed deep-seated issues that wouldn't disappear overnight, no matter how many reforms were put in place. Despite the challenges, though, there was hope. Hope that transparency and accountability could replace secrecy and intimidation. Hope that neighbors could learn to look out for each other instead of policing each other. And hope that Willow Pines could evolve into something better. Not just a picture-perfect suburb, but a true community where people felt safe, respected, and free to be themselves. By the end of it all, one thing was certain. Change doesn't come easily, especially when power structures are deeply entrenched. But sometimes, standing up to authority isn't just brave, it's necessary. And while Willow Pines still had a long way to go, we were finally moving in the right direction. Months after the scandal broke, Willow Pines began to feel like a different place. The transformation wasn't immediate or perfect. It never is when trust has been shattered. But slowly, things started to shift. New leadership took over the HOA, promising transparency and accountability. Gone were the days of arbitrary fines and invasive patrols. Instead, residents worked together to create guidelines that felt fair and reasonable. Brightly painted front doors started appearing around the neighborhood, and for the first time in years, people seemed to smile more freely. Jake settled back into his routine, though he remained cautious around unfamiliar faces. "You can't unring a bell," he said one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Once you see how ugly things can get, it's hard to forget." Still, he couldn't deny the positive changes happening around us. Neighbors who once avoided him now greeted him warmly, some even thanking him for exposing the truth. It was bittersweet. He didn't seek recognition, but he also knew the sacrifices he'd made weren't in vain. Agent Reynolds stayed in touch, occasionally dropping by to check on Jake or share updates about the ongoing investigations. To my surprise, Jake grew fond of him, treating him almost like a mentor. Their conversation sparked something in my brother, a newfound sense of purpose. He began researching careers in law enforcement, talking excitedly about how he might one day help others fight against injustice. Watching this side of him emerge was inspiring, even if it meant letting go of the carefree Jake I'd always known. Dad threw himself into community activism, attending every HOA meeting and advocating for policies that prioritized fairness over control. His passion rubbed off on Mom, who organized monthly potlucks to bring neighbors closer together. These gatherings became a cornerstone of our lives, offering a space where people could laugh, share stories, and rebuild connections that had frayed under the weight of fear and mistrust. As for me, I found myself reflecting on the lessons we all learned. Before the scandal, I'd taken Willow Pines at face value, a pristine suburb where life moved at its own quiet pace. But beneath the surface lay cracks caused by unchecked power and misplaced priorities. The HOA's downfall taught me that rules are only as good as the intentions behind them. When they're used to control rather than protect, communities suffer, and so do the people within them. Still, healing takes time. Not everyone welcomed the changes with open arms. Some residents continued to defend the old ways, clinging to the belief that strict regulations were necessary to maintain order. Others simply left, unwilling to stay in a neighborhood tainted by controversy. But for every skeptic, there was someone willing to embrace the new direction Willow Pines was heading in. Kids played outside without worrying about being scolded for riding their bikes too close to the curb. Families decorated their homes for holidays without fearing fines for using unapproved colors. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to feel alive again. Looking back, I realized how much we'd grown, not just as individuals, but as a community. The HOA scandal had forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and each other. It showed us the dangers of blind compliance and the importance of questioning authority. Most importantly, it reminded us that true harmony comes not from rigid rules, but from mutual respect and understanding. One crisp autumn afternoon, as leaves swirled in golden spirals across lawns, I stood on our porch and watched Jake toss a football with Dad in the driveway. Mom was inside baking cookies, her favorite way to unwind, while laughter drifted through the open windows. For the first time in what felt like forever, everything seemed peaceful. Willow Pines would never be the same as it was before the scandal. And maybe that was okay. Because sometimes breaking apart is the first step toward building something stronger, brighter, and more beautiful than before.